Well, good evening. Glad you're here tonight. A little cool outside, but still glad you're here. That's why we have a coat we can wear to get out. We're going to be in Matthew 24, where we're going to start tonight, and we're going to be in this for 3 or 4 weeks at least, something like that, because we want to get a good understanding of it and how things are operating here. We'll begin with a word of prayer. Tommy Chisholm, would you lead some prayer? Matthew 24 is probably one of the most misunderstood and abused chapters in the Bible, because many individuals will go there and they're trying to find the end of time in that particular chapter. And by doing so, many have predicted dates when the Christ was going to return, and yet it didn't happen based on that chapter. And many are using it even today, everything that's going on over there in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas and the war and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and they try to go to it and try to find reasons as to say the Lord's coming soon. And again, none of that's going to happen. They're in error on this, but yet they won't stop. Even though years ago people made the same arguments and used events that were taking place in the world, and they're gone, and nothing happened. And the same thing will happen, I think, on this. Whenever this skirmish concludes over in Israel, and things die down, and they will eventually. If it'll fade away, then another one will happen, here they go again. But when it comes to Matthew 24, there's 3 things to understand about it that help us to realize what Christ is speaking of. The first thing, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that takes place in 70 AD. At least in the first 34 verses, he's talking about that. In Matthew 24, there's 3 questions that are asked and that are answered. And again, the key verse is verse 34. We'll get there. We won't get there tonight. We may not even get there next week to verse 34. But it's going to be, you'll see it, a key verse that so many miss on that, talking about when these things that Christ is speaking of was going to happen. Now, the destruction of Jerusalem. There's some things we need to know about history. And the more we know about history of that time, when we get into Matthew 24, we can understand what Christ is speaking about. Because we can look back and see these things that took place. Why did Rome want to destroy Jerusalem? The Jewish people didn't like living under the Roman rule. They wanted to be their own government, set their own rules, and Rome came in and sort of pushed them around, and they had to do things the Roman way in many ways, and they didn't like that. And many occasions they would rebel, the Jewish people, or certain ones would rebel against the Roman government, and they would try to overthrow it, and many of the Jews would get killed. And this was ongoing skirmish that was taking place between Rome and the Jewish people for the entire time that Rome was in power. There was a group of individuals called the Zealots. And we might look at them as being rebels, Jewish rebels. And they hated Rome. I mean, they hated Rome with a passion. And on different occasions, these groups would attack some Roman soldiers, not just in Jerusalem, but all over Judea, and all these little cities here and there. And they would kill some of them, and then they would run. They would flee. And this was ongoing as well, but they were zealots. And the Jewish people didn't like them, even though they were, in a sense, trying to gain Jewish freedom. But these zealots, many of them are very immoral people, very immoral. They would go into one of these little cities and they would plunder and they would steal from the people that were there. They were very immoral sexually. Anything would go with them. It didn't matter. Anything. We think things are bad today. They were just as bad or worse with these individuals. They would go into a town and they would seize and kidnap people, women, and rape them and kill them, murder and all that. Drunkenness. They were known for those things. And the Roman government got enough of it. They got enough of it, and that's what is leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Because when they would go to these little cities, these zealots would, and many of them would hang out there, and they would start just tormenting the people. And Rome would go in and sort of rough them up and get them out. And that's what was happening during this time, and especially between 66 and 70 AD, because the Roman general over the army, Vespasian, in 66 AD, he decided, I'm going to shut these zealots down. So he started going to these small cities, and he would attack and do his best to kill them. But many of them would escape, and they were fleeing to these other cities. And as they went back and forth, he would chase them. And eventually, these zealots made their way to Jerusalem, the ones that survived the Roman attack. And they got to Jerusalem, and they said, we're not going to give up Jerusalem. We're going to take our stand right here, and we got this wall fortified around Jerusalem, and we're going to fight them all the way to the death. And that's what those zealots were going to do. So that's why eventually it came down to Jerusalem for this big battle in 70 AD, because that's where all the zealots had gone to. That's where they had fled to. Which apostle was a zealot? There was an apostle that was a zealot. Simon in Luke 6:15, he was a zealot. Christ brought in one of these men. He brought in all kind of different 12 men that were different. And there's a zealot that came in. Some think that Barabbas was a zealot. Possibly, he was one that people had an option of freeing him or Jesus, and they freed him. Some think that he was a zealot because of what he was being charged with. But anyway, Vespasian, 66 AD, he started cleaning these little cities out. In 68 AD, Nero died. He was murdered. Some think maybe he committed suicide. I don't know which one it was. But after Nero dies, they have, in the next 2 years, they have 4 different emperors. 4. For about 6 months, they'd have one, and he would die. Somebody would murder him, and they get another emperor. And Vespasian here was waiting until things got settled, because he wanted to make sure he was okay with the emperor to go in and do this, because Nero had died. He wanted to make sure that everything's good. So he's making his way, getting ready, but he can't find an emperor who is well enough to take a stand. Well, in around 69 AD, he got tired of waiting, and he goes and surrounds Jerusalem in 69. He said, I'm tired of waiting. I'm going to go ahead and attack, and I'll kill them out. That's what I'm going to do, because no emperor was alive long enough for him to talk with. And as he was getting ready to attack, he had surrounded Jerusalem. And this is very important. Word came to him from Rome that the army wanted to make him emperor, Vespasian. Well, that sounds great to him. So he says, okay, army, let's back off. I'm going to go to Rome, and they're going to make me an emperor. And I'm going to put Titus in charge of the army. And he goes, and he becomes emperor around 69 A.D. He puts Titus in charge of the army. And then on April 14, 70 A.D., this is 3 days before Passover, Titus surrounds the city. And on a normal day, the population of Jerusalem is around 200,000 people. Because this was so close to Passover, 3 days, all these Jews, men would come into Jerusalem to worship as they were commanded to do. And there's around, some guesstimate, 2 to 3 million people in Jerusalem. So Titus has surrounded the city with all these Jews inside. And they know what he's going to do. He's going to attack. So they're ready to fight. All these men who've come in, men and women, everybody's going to fight to overcome this Roman aggression that's coming in. But the problem was that Titus he couldn't break through the walls. He was trying to. But they were shooting at him, dropping hot oil over on the Roman soldiers and everything else, trying to kill them. And they killed a lot of them. And the more they killed, the madder Titus got. And then on August 30th, 70 A.D., he finally broke through. Because after surrounding the city, nobody was coming in, nobody was going out, and they were starving to death. 3 million people in this size of a city did a lot of eating, and there was nothing there to eat. And they were eating donkey heads. They had to buy at a tremendous price. I think I got it later on mentioned somewhere. Josephus talked about a woman who killed her baby and ate her baby during this time. There was nothing to eat, and they would find dove dung. And they'd pick through it and get the seeds out and try to make some kind of bread or crush the seeds, something like that. This was a terrible time that was happening here during this about a 3.5 month period. And they were getting weaker inside, and that allowed Titus to really go in and really do his killing once he got inside. A Roman historian by the name of Tacitus, he said 600,000 people were killed when Rome got inside the city. 600,000. Now Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, he said 1.1 million were killed. Either way, you put it in the middle somewhere, that's a lot of people that were murdered by the Rome when they went in and did all this killing. Now, the important thing to see here, when Vespasian surrounded the city the first time, and they called him and told him, hey, they called him, I don't know how they got hold of him, they told him, come to Rome, and we're going to make you emperor. He backed his army off, and historians say that approximately 50,000 Christians fled Jerusalem during that time. They got out because they remembered something that Jesus said about Jerusalem being destroyed. When you see the armies surround the city, get out. That's what Jesus told them. We're going to cover that in 24. And they did. And many of them went to a little city called Pella. Now here's what Eusebius, who was a Greek Christian historian, he wrote he lived from 265 to 339 AD, but he wrote about things he collected about what happened during this 70 AD time. And here's what he said. The whole body, however, of the church at Jerusalem, having been commanded by divine revelation, given to men of approved piety there before the war, removed from the city and dwelt at a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pella. So many of them got out whenever that Vespasian first surrounded the city and then backed off. They remembered what Christ said and they got out. Did all of them get out? Probably not. Because Christians can be hard-headed sometimes. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it the next day. That's the way Christians do. We procrastinate. And it may be that some of them listen to the wrong person. And we're going to see that many Christ warned of many false Christs that will come about. And it very well could be that all these Christians were leaving, and here's all these false Christs that were around, Messiahs, and they begin saying, "Oh, don't leave. I'm the Messiah. Don't leave. Stay here. God will protect us." And maybe some listen to those. But around 50,000 did get out before the final Titus came back and surrounded, and nobody got out before that happened. That's important to know. History is important to know as we get into this, and we'll recognize what's happening based on history. Now, these individuals here, they didn't have history when this was being written. They just had to recognize the sign and get out. But we have history, and it helps us to see what was taking place during this time. Now, verse 1 and 2. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." If you back up to chapter 24, he's been in the temple, and that's when he talks about the widow's mite, how she gave more than everybody else, and because she gave all she had. And so they exit the temple, and the disciples are just taken in the beauty. Man, this is a great place. And a Jewish person loved the temple. I mean, they loved the temple. It was their life. Their life revolved around the temple. We can't say that. Well, we're not Jews, okay? What about the church? Well, yes, but what about this building? Our life doesn't revolve around this building. We know what the church is. Church is people. If for some reason this building were destroyed, we would build another. We would do something. We'd meet somewhere else the one was built. But for a Jewish person, if that temple were destroyed, it would just cause their life to crumble. Because God came to that place, that temple, once a year, had their sins rolled back. 3 times a year they had to go to the temple and worship. All these other times that they would just go there to learn and to be taught and to meet people and just see all these things and trade. There was commerce there. And it was a major hub of Jerusalem and of a Jewish person's life. So Christ has just told them, this thing going to come down. And they are just, mouth has dropped. What did he say? Did he say what we think he said? Remember, their genealogy was in this temple. They could trace their genealogy back all the way to the time when the tribes were divided. People were divided into tribes. They could trace them all the way back to there. But when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., Titus destroyed all that. He destroyed all of it. And now the Jews have no idea what tribe they're from. And Titus destroyed the chief priest system, the high priest. And they don't have a high priest and such anymore. They don't know who's who. Got to be a Levite. Nobody knows who a Levite is. It's just a mangled mess. And that's why it was so important to them to have this place of worship, and yet Christ is saying here, it's about to be torn down. In verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So they leave Jerusalem, they leave the temple, they go to the Mount of Olives, and they're probably not saying a word, at least not to Jesus, that may be talking among themselves. What did he say? Did he say it's going to be torn down? What does all this mean? And everything. So when they get there, they have some questions. When is this going to happen? When is this temple coming down? They won't know. And what's going to be some signs when this is going to happen? And is this going to be the end of the world when this happens? That's what they're thinking. End of the age, end of the world. So they got some questions. And here Christ is going to answer them. Give them an answer. And we're going to look at the first question. And is, when will these things be? And Christ covers this. When the temple is going to be torn down between verses 4 and 34. He's going to tell them when this temple is going to come down. At least he's going to give them, here's the signs you look for. And then verse 4 and 5. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." So whenever it really gets tough, again, Christ is saying, don't listen to these false Christs. There are going to be many of them out there. Between 33 A.D. and 70 A.D., Josephus speaks of 24 different ones who claim to be Jesus, who claim to be the Messiah. 24 that we know of. So there was a lot of people in Jerusalem that were trying to trick the people, thinking that they're the Jesus. And if they did, if they tricked some of them, they believed this, it was going to cost them their life probably, because they wouldn't get out when they saw these signs. It wouldn't happen. Now here's some of those that history speaks about that were the false Christ. One was Theudas. He was one, we're going to look at him in a minute, Theudas. Another here is Dositheus. He was the founder of the Gnostics. The Gnostics were a group of individuals that felt they had a little bit more knowledge than anybody else. They could read between the lines. They could interpret Scripture better. And John had to battle them as far as knowledge goes in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. He had to battle them all the time. So this second man who claimed to be a Jesus or Messiah, we'll look at him in a second. The third one, Bar Tobias, couldn't find a whole lot about him. Sabbathai Levi, know a little bit about him. And of course, we know Jim Jones and David Koresh. We know those guys. They've been around just since we've been around. So ever since Christ came about, you had those who made the claim that they were Jesus. Now this first one, Theudas. In Acts 5:36, we find him mentioned. For some time ago, Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody. That claiming to be somebody is somebody making the claim they're the Messiah. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. So here's Theudas, who is mentioned in history. The Judas of Galilee, I couldn't find anything on him, but he existed because the Bible says he was around at that time, so we know he was there. But Theudas here, he was killed in 46 AD. So it tells a little bit of a time frame here for Acts 5 when his name is mentioned around 46 AD or so. Now I want us to look at Acts 8 and verse 9. Another man. But there was a certain man called Simon who previously practiced sorcery in the city and astonished the people of Samaria, claiming he was someone great. Again, he was astonishing the people with miraculous works, supposedly, claiming to be someone great. That's the Messiah. Another man here during the time of these apostles that were making this great claim. Now, this when we look at the second one on that list, the Sosius, that guy. He confronted a man. History, we have history on this. He confronted a man named Simon. Don't know if it's this Simon or not. The Sosius was a man, so he believed he was the Messiah. And he had a lot of people he was fooling about this. Well, he comes across a man named Simon. Could be this guy. He didn't like it that this Simon feller was making a claim that he was the Messiah. You couldn't have two Messiahs at the same time. So the Sosius gets him a metal pole and begins to beat Simon. Don't know if it's this one or not, but he began to beat him. And as he was beating him, now this is history. This is not inspired stuff. The pole suddenly evaporated. Just poof, poof, and it was gone. And the Sosius said, okay, because that happened, that means that you're the Messiah. And he got down on his knees and he worshiped this man named Simon. And the Sosius there again thought he was, but he wasn't. So there you go. There again you have that. So here's our listing again. Theudas, he was around. The Sosius, founder of the Gnostics. Again, he gave it up, supposedly. This other guy, Bar Chaboas, he was around 132 AD. Sabbathai Levi, he was around 1626 or 1676. He claimed to be the Christ. He was captured by some Muslims, and they told him, if you didn't convert over, we're going to kill you. Well, he converted over to be a Muslim. So he wasn't much of a Messiah, was he? He converted right over real quick, so he wouldn't have any pain. And of course, then we have Jim Jones that killed 600-something people with the Kool-Aid, and then David Koresh in Waco, Texas, who claimed to be the Christ and such. So we go back to Matthew 24, 4 and 5. That's where Christ makes that claim. Many are going to be saying, I'm the Christ. Going to deceive many. Don't listen to them. They were there. They were there alive and well. And Christ gave warning of that. So again, that's where we end tonight. So we see there's history can tell us a few things about what's happening this time. And it wasn't a good time to be a Christian during this time, but still, if they listen to Christ, they would at least save their life and get out of the city. Any comment on what we covered tonight so far? All right, we'll take up next week in verse 6. It is a very interesting verse as well. Well, they all are, but this one really is.